Okay, we're recording, and I want to introduce you again to the wonderful Detox Whisperer, Heston, the author of the book, First Day of the Week, ? It's a good book. I have one here. I'm going to put on, while he's talking, I'll put on a link to where you can get that book. And so, tell us a little bit more about the fat diet, or a recap of last time, Mark, if you would.
Yeah. just kind of a summary of sorts. Well, yeah, I was under the misconception as an Adventist that we were not to partake of the fat in the blood. And I guess there is a verse in Leviticus that kind of leads us to that concept of no fat, along with the idea of no blood. But when I read that in context, it was talking specifically about the sacrifice that's brought to the temple. That's the fat that you're not to partake of.
Right.
Anyhow, so that opened up a whole new venue for me, and so I had to go back to Acts 15 because I thought the requisite that they made for the Gentiles was no fat and blood, and I went back there, and lo and behold, no, it was just the blood that they weren't supposed to. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so I was like, so that kind of put me in a whole new study, and it just opened up a whole box. It was like amazing. So anyway, I can kind of give you a little rundown on what I've studied in reference to that, and I hope that this might be a blessing for those that are attending and those that might get a chance to view this another time maybe. So you want me to open up with prayer, Jackson? Or?
Certainly.
Okay. All right. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for the season that you brought us into, this seventh month, and we're looking about laying all our sins of omission and commission at your feet. I pray that you continue to reveal to us those things we need to lay before you, and help us, Father, to be more reliant upon you. I know my biggest sin has been self-reliance, trying to do things in my own strength. And Father, just pray that you'd be with your people in this way, that you would cast these sins into the depths of the sea. And Father, now we just pray that you'd attend us in this little monologue and subsequent discussion, and we thank you for your presence, and we ask this now in your Son's name.
Amen.
All right. So yeah, it was about 4,200 years ago that Noah and his family had stepped off the ark, and they did so into a drastically changed environment. And the food that was prescribed to them when they came off the ark was animal products. As virtually all the vegetation was lost that first year, we can understand that. But now, prior to the flood, man's food was just herbs and fruit. This is where we get this idea about the vegetarian diet. This is herbs and fruit that bore seed unto itself. That's Genesis 1, 11, 12, and 29. And this simple fare did have a much broader diversity of nutrients with a much higher vitality back then, as both man and animal had enjoyed the incredible assimilation of these things, right? Because we had a much longer lifespan back then. But at the global deluge, there came the loss of the firmament canopy, causing a tremendous vertical expanse in the atmosphere with reduced air pressure, which caused the the influx of damaging UV radiation, which contributed to the increase of this nitrogen-oxygen ratio, causing nitrogen to go way high, oxygen coming down, which diminished the chlorophyll production in all plants across the entire globe. And now, for the first time since the flood now, fruit can now ferment. Prior to that added oxygen, high-pressure environment, fruit could not ferment. And so this explains why the first account of drunkenness was after the flood, right? Noah was the first drunk, it says in Genesis 9:21. And the animals that previously, like after sin, previous to the flood, those that had become omnivores after sin, now after the flood became carnivores, and some of the herbivores became omnivores, like man, because it says that in Genesis 9:3, man's food was to be the animal. And I'm going to get into some details specific to the Hebrew on that verse, which is quite enlightening and may answer allay some real problems that, because it says to eat the entire, every animal. And it's not what it says in the Hebrew. So we're going to come to what it really says here in a little bit. But even the mosquitoes who were pollinating fruit suckers became blood suckers after sin. But man himself was explicitly instructed not to eat the blood because of his sin, as he was responsible for the degradation of all life, for life is in the blood. And as a consequence, man's continual unrepentant sin, all living things lost another measure of Yah's sustaining vibrancy, if you will. And so after Noah had exited the ark, Yahweh had told him, he says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. Like I had mentioned that to your fathers before you. And he had prescribed their food to be, and here it is, the entire animal. That word every in the Hebrew, if you look it up, it's the word kol. It actually means every part, all, the whole.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And if you go to the Paleo-Hebrew, those two letters, I think that let's see, that is the, I think it's a, I can't remember if it's a pei and a lamed, but in Paleo-Hebrew, it relates to a tameable, yokeable. So it's an entire animal that's tameable and yokeable that you're to eat the entire animal. And so that would relate to a clean animal, minus the blood, of course. That was the only thing that we weren't supposed to eat of an entire animal.
Well, that's kind of a revelation right there, isn't it?
Absolutely, because a lot of people see, will jump on that verse and say, well, see, look at that, we can eat anything we want. It even says it in Genesis. Look at it right after the, it's like, wait a minute. So anyhow,
would you mind reiterating that in English so we have that?
Okay, yeah, okay. All right, so that word every, right, that verse starts off with the word every animal. That word every in Hebrew is the word kol. That's number 3605 in the Strongs. By the way, I got a Thayer's Greek lexicon. I really like that one.
Good.
But, of course, that's only in Greek. I'm trying to find another Hebrew one. But anyway, I mean, the mere fact that even in the Strongs it says every part, and of course now I'm using an older Strongs. This is a pre-1985. And that particular edition, I think it's Hendricks Publishing, it's got a lot more information under each one of these number definitions than some of the other more contemporary Strongs that we have today. But
I'm not going to get on anybody anymore for Strongs.
No, you're right in the respect that we should have a second witness. We need to have another means of looking up, words. But so anyway, yeah. So the word kol means entire, and when you look at the Paleo-Hebrew, you look at those two letters together. I looked this, Jeff Benner. You're familiar with him. I have some of his books, and one in particular, he goes into the history of the Hebrew alphabet into the Paleo language, and he'll put two letters together, and he's done a lot of research to bring out the meaning of Paleo letters adjacent to each other and all these different combinations. And he says that those two letters together, now he's not making any reference back to this word particularly, but he's saying that you put those two letters together, it means tameable, yokeable. So kol is the entire tameable, yokeable animal. So which is a clean animal. Okay. So now what's interesting, and what was mentioned in that verse in Genesis 9:3, nothing's mentioned about fruit. Wow. The only prescribed fruit was the entire animal and the green herb. That's all he said. he didn't reiterate the herb of the field or the fruit of the tree, or bearing seed of itself. Now, he didn't necessarily say don't eat that, but the fact that he had prescribed the entire animal in green herb. And so with the changes in the environment, this is the first time we see this word, or this combination, this term, green herb. And so with the changes in the animal kingdom and the changes amongst the greenery, I'm sure there's probably changes in some of the foods that they started eating back then. So, but I find it interesting that fruit wasn't commanded after the flood. And it turns out that if you happen to eat fruit with meat as a simple carbohydrate with protein, you do that in this environment, and it'll actually begin to ferment in your stomach if you eat it together. But the animal eaten with the green herb, vegetables and greens, has been declared to be the perfect food combination by a consensus of independent nutritional experts. And so the whole animal is what is inferred to be food. And so the only thing not to be eaten is the blood. So to eat only the meat, now think about this for a minute, to eat only the meat without the organs or the connective tissue, the fat, the bones, and the cartilage, as all the indigenous societies had done, even up to this last century, is actually eating the least valuable portion of the animal. Think about that. I mean, that's incredible. Missing out on some of the most important nutrients for man's cellular regeneration. And all indigenous societies, third world countries that had no connection with the Western society whatsoever, had lived this way. They all lived on meat. In fact, the guy who had done the research back in the 1930s, his name was Weston A. Price. And I'd highly recommend you guys to go to that website. It's called WestonAPriceFoundation.org. It's an excellent resource for what's being explained in the Bible as to what our diet is. And this guy had traveled, during the Great Depression. He was a very respected dentist in the Cleveland area, and he took it upon himself. Him and his wife traveled to these really remote areas on several continents, fully expecting to find that the healthiest people in the world, that was his intent, was to document the dentition and all healthy elements relevant to different tribal groups. And he was fully expecting to find all sorts of vegetarian peoples. And he was completely disappointed to find that all these people, the healthiest people in the world, that were out there unassociated with modern man, were meat eaters. And they ate every part of the animal, just like it says in Genesis 9:3, what we're supposed to be doing. And these people are closer to Noah's, the statute that was given to Noah, than we are. And so they reap the health benefits for it, right? So these indigenous societies, they lived longer, had a better quality of life than Western man, who today has access to all kinds of conveniences, decadent foods, and of course, medical specialists to go along with it, right? So now Yahweh, he didn't forbid the use of fruit after the flood, but as the more recent indigenous tribes had done, let's say as the descendants of Noah, right, Ham and Japheth, I think would probably be most of those. They came to eat mostly fruit in their season, and this is what Noah had come to discover. When he, after drinking the stored juice of his first grape harvest, the way that he did, and drinking it, some of it, it says in Jubilees, 6 months later after he harvested it, right, with at least a few family members, and this had its consequence. So Jubilees says that after, quote, a week of years, unquote, that's 7 years, from the flood, Noah planted a vineyard, and in the 4th year he had gathered in the fruit in the 7th month. Now that was about 10 and a half years after the flood. And so he made wine, and it says in Jubilees that he put it into a vessel and kept it unto the 5th year, until the first day of the new month of the first month. That's Jubilees 7, along with Genesis 9, 20 and 21. And so Scripture does say that Noah had gotten drunk, and apparently his wife and Ham did as well, as, quote, the father's nakedness, as it says in Genesis 9:2, thy father's nakedness is described in Leviticus as the nakedness of thy father's wife. That's Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, and also in Ezekiel 22. So the proper rendering in Genesis 9:22 is that Ham experienced is the word. The Hebrew word is raha. It is translated saw, right? He saw his father's nakedness. But no, the word should actually be Ham experienced the nakedness of his father's wife, his mother. And this is why Canaan, who is the first one mentioned in the story, was the one cursed and not Ham, for Canaan was the offspring of this incestual encounter induced by...
Oh, well, that makes every bit of sense.
Okay, very good. And so, yeah, so this, of course, it was all, induced by intoxication between Ham and his mother, right? So Noah's wife, and so consequently, this is why Canaan, his name, he was named that because his name means humiliated. The poor guy was humiliated, right, because of what happened, and had to suffer the consequences. That's why Ham did not get cursed. It was Canaan who got cursed because he was the outcome of that. Now, if Ham had inadvertently seen his father's naked, just the father himself being naked, as he mentioned his concern to his brothers, why didn't he walk backwards to cover him, right? Unless he awoke from his stupor and came to realize his actions, and his brothers came to his rescue before their mom, unaware of her own state, came out of the tent. So that's basically what was going on there. And so sin actually had carried itself, from that antediluvian environment into Noah's family.
Would you be implying that Noah didn't know the effects of fermentation?
Yeah. Okay. Now, that I was just going to get to that actually. You'd think that, because Yahweh had talked to him, I'm sure more than the times recorded when he was building the ark, those few times, right? I'm sure that he was probably warned that, hey, you need to take store it this way. I don't know. I don't know what happened with that. Maybe he overindulged. Maybe he forgot that, hey, well, maybe they told him, well, you only want to drink this much. And he was used to drinking a lot more in the other environment. I don't know. But but I will say that Noah did abide by the statute in growing the fruit properly, by planting a vineyard, waiting 3 years, and then harvesting that fruit, and then using that to celebrate the first day, the true Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Aviv. But so anyway, yeah. See, I guess he must have lost the memo on how to store the juice, or how to go about celebrating that, right? But certainly not handling fruit properly have brought a curse upon the family, and this same thing continues today, as will be discussed later as we go along here. And so they're food preserving for the colder months, with the change in the environment, with now winter, spring, summer, fall coming every year, that their predominant means of preserving food became sun drying green herbs, sun drying and salting meats, and actually you can take the organs and keep the fat on them with the raw tallow and the fascia undisturbed, and you can hang that, and you can keep that for quite a while. And then all you have to do is just scrape off the surface fat, because the fat acts as a antimicrobial barrier. And so it's just kind of a natural means to actually store that, which is kind of a built-in package, which is kind of interesting. And of course, they sun-dried the grasses, and those were stored for grazing animals. As some of the animals were milked, and a few were humanely, slaughtered and drained of their blood, and they utilized the whole body. And so consequently, cooked fruit, openly stored juice was never on the menu. It was never mentioned as a prescription for the new diet in the New World, or post-flood. So the practices that these indigenous people have been doing for millennia I believe, has its foundations in the time of Noah. And we as the civilized people have kind of lost all those most of those concepts. So the herb yielding seed in Genesis 1:29, all seed-bearing plants, which included grains, I think, from the time of creation, and the herb of the field, right, from Genesis 3:18, all vegetables, since the entrance of sin, as prescribed foods, had also suffered a change after the flood. As these non-hybridized heirloom varieties that were brought upon the ark, it says in Genesis 6, verse 21, they were found by the sons of Noah to have a much better balance of nutrition and biogenetics, more congruent with human metabolism, when they continue to plant, harvest, and process these according to the methods ordained from the beginning. That's Genesis 1:14. In other words, they learned to utilize the position of the moon and the sun in respect of when to plant and when to harvest certain plants. I think they were doing that before the flood because of Genesis 1:14. Now, the descendants of Ham and Japheth, now they also became strong civilizations, not to mention, as Shem's line certainly did. And down through the centuries, their descendants, Ham and Japheth, they were tending their flocks and herds, some of which, being unclean animals that they participated in. But they were growing mostly non-glutinous grains as fruit of the ground. And the Aztecs, they grew amaranth. The Incas grew quinoa, Chinese rice, the Africans sorghum, the Ethiopians teff, Mongols millet, right? And the descendants of Shem, who tended flocks and herds, mostly ruminant animals that were clean, they happened to grow more glutinous grains, known today as spelt, and maybe you guys have heard some of these before. You got spelt, kamut, emmer, einkorn. These are all varieties in the wheat family. And then, of course, you got barley and rye. So those are your predominantly gluten-based grains, and those were grown within the Fertile Crescent, predominantly by those in the Caucasus region. And, in this same region, ultimately brought forth, some of the more progressive civilizations. You have Egypt and Israel, you have Babylon, Greece, and Rome. And arguably, some of these were more aggressive and, of course, unscrupulous. But this is where leavened bread actually originated from. Now, of course, Adam was making bread, but he wasn't making leavened bread. And the reason why they were making leavened bread is because of the gluten in it, right? And they would make this sourdough bread, right? They would use a slow-acting yeast back then, as opposed to a fast one that they use commercially today. But which actually the slow yeast does a better job of breaking up those tough gluten proteins. And they would even sprout the grains to leaven some of them. And now what's significant about this, though, with these glutinous grains, now these heirloom varieties, they had only, get this, they had only 5 to 10% the gluten content compared to the glutinous grains today. I mean, that's incredible. 5 to 10% and yet they were still able to raise the dough. There was enough gluten in there to raise the dough, but we have, oh my gosh, you know, so many times more gluten in our hybridized varieties today. And that's what's creating a lot of our problems with grains, is this hybridized and the gluten aspect. And I'll get into that here in a bit. Yeah, and so with the right kind of yeast, you know, if you inoculate the dough properly, you know, you can create a more easily digested and assimilated food if you have an heirloom variety, a low gluten-based grain, right? So Shem's descendants had used these gluten-based grains, these low gluten, right, to grow in what became known, you know, this Fertile Crescent area in the Middle East. But apparently, due to the added sin and changed environment, they came to prepare them a little differently than their brothers, right, because of this gluten content. So accordingly, gluten has a slower motility index through the intestines, requiring special handling at harvest. And I think a lot of the grains did. You had to treat them properly, and so some of the way that they had processed the grain after the harvesting is similar to some of the other grains, but in order to minimize these problems, they had to do this, use the yeast. Now, the reason why barley is really the only glutinous grain that was used for unleavened bread. And part of the reason for that, not only for the fact that, you know, barley was the first one to get ripe, and that was part of the unleavened 7-day feast in that first month, is that barley has the least amount of gluten of all the glutinous grains. And so it was, so consequently, it didn't really, even if you tried to leaven, it wouldn't raise very much. I mean, that's how little gluten was actually in the barley. So, and so this was always part of the unleavened bread. And so the gluten in barley is actually a different kind of protein than that in the wheat. In the gluten in the wheat, it's hordein versus gliadin in the wheat. So enough of that boring stuff. But let's see. Yeah, and so, and you guys probably are fully aware that you know, all the wave sheath offerings, right? The first cut of all the Hebrews that were brought in on the 10th day of the first month, those sheave bread, you know, the show bread, actually you call it sheave bread because it was from the first cuttings, and all those little trees, if you will, right? The bundled grouping of the grains sitting there all bundled up. They look like little trees, and they were just stacked all within the courtyard, and all that barley was used in the course of the year for the temple service. Okay, let's see. I'm going to pick this up at another point here. And
can I ask a little question?
Sure.
I'm pretty ignorant about this material. What exactly is the danger of gluten? Now, I know about celiac disease.
Right, right.
But there are some that say this is just really, there's nothing to it. It doesn't really exist, but in very few people. And I know that there are so many people that claim to have this disease or are not eating gluten.
Well, you know, it's interesting that it's actually the descendants of Shem that have this genetic marker and tendency towards celiac and Crohn's disease, which is all gluten-based issues. But you know, if we had if we had utilized, we as Shem's descendants, if we had utilized heirloom, non-hybridized grain as it was originally ordained, even before the flood, and if we follow the proper means of doing the harvesting and processing of the grain, we wouldn't be having this problem. You know, because we have 20 times the gluten today in the hybridized version of wheat and even rye, has anywhere from 14 to 20 times the amount of gluten of the non-hybridized. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, think about going, you know, if you're even 14 times, think about going 10 miles an hour down the road. 14 times that is what? You're going 140 miles an hour. I mean, it's a big difference to think about that. And so that's a lot of gluten. Now, gluten, and if you're using a fast-rising yeast, in other words, it's not thoroughly impregnating the gluten protein adequately enough to break up those proteins into peptide molecules. Peptides are little chains of amino acids so that your body can then break it down further. And so consequently, you're going to have these clumps of protein that go through your gut that don't get fully digested. It's more difficult to digest improperly processed gluten than it is properly cooked meat. Properly cooked meat is actually easier to digest. Your gluten can hang around in your gut. Now, if you cook your meat beyond, well, let's see, certainly if you cook your meat well done. Now you've denatured the protein almost to the extent of gluten, and so now it's going to take 3 to 4 days. Both gluten and overcooked meat is going to take about 3 or 4 days to fully make its way through the gut. And so, we're compromising our digestive system by doing that on a regular basis. So when the Hebrews, when they harvested their grain, you know, they would bundle up in sheaves, and they would bundle it up and into stacks, and just have it upright. And this would allow the phytoliths that remained in the stem to be drawn up into the heads of the grain, while it's still even disassociated from the roots. It's still connected to the ground, so it's geomagnetically still connected there. And it would sit there for about a week, and then this would allow the full sustenance of the stem to go into those grain heads. And then they would take the fully ripened plant, then they would thresh, winnow, and sift, right? And they would do that all by hand, as opposed to what we do today, all mechanically, without any human touch virtually. So we were actually personally, so just as they were to thresh, winnow, and sift by hand, we are to be personally threshed upon the rock, put to the wind of the Spirit, sifted by the Master's hand. And in consideration, what we allow to be done to our food is actually done to us spiritually.
Oh.
So there is a spiritual consequence to the foods that we make a decision to ingest. So this non-mechanical, more personal and intentional process to the live grain berries with the germ, bran, and endosperm, all one entity, actually gave it a positive energy signature, which allowed that grain to actually store better and actually contributed to better assimilation when they went to eat that, which is kind of interesting. So let's see. Another practice the Hebrews came to do is soaking their grains and making sprouted grains. This was also more common amongst the Caucasus region where they had more glutinous grains. And again, when you sprout your grains, that also, the live plant is actually utilizing that gluten protein and making that small little plant in there. So you're actually now making those proteins more assimilable when you sprout them and make sprouted bread. And so you have a low gluten content with sprouted bread. And if you get true sprouted bread, in other words, where you take those little tails that come off the berry, if they're at least the length of the berry or longer, then you know you got pretty much most of the gluten is used up into that little plant. But a lot of times what the practice is commercially is just, barely getting those little heads out, and then they call it sprouted, and then they process it. But that kind of sprouted bread does have gluten in it. So anyhow, all right, let's see. So yeah, over the past 60 years, with each new decade of hybridization came an attempt by the industry to produce greater gluten yields or more bread per bushel. You got somebody at the door, or no? As the gluten index of the grain rose over these years. I mean, like, it was just kind of crazy. But it was because of, you know, trying to get the most bang for the buck out of the grain. Get more bread out of the per acre. And so these hybridized grains being very high in gluten content, composed of out-of-sequence peptides, right? When you hybridize a grain, now the protein has a jumbled amino acid sequence that's different from the non-hybridized. And guess what? Our bodies are not designed to process that properly. We have, I'm going to get into this a little further in here, but we have a microbiome in our gut. And that is the fauna or the flora of the bacteria in our gut. They actually aid our digestion process. And so when we change the amino acid profile of something that used to be our food, now we got a whole different class of bacteria, don't we? It's not the bacteria that Yahweh had actually intended, but well, I'll get into that in a little bit more later here, but but what's happened with our lifestyle and the use of antibiotics, you know, we can get into vaccines and, you know, chemical fertilizers and all this stuff, you know, has contributed to a generation now where we've got a lot of kids that that have a whole host of brain problems. You know, we see almost an epidemic of autism, and amongst the teenagers, we're seeing a lot of schizophrenia. There's a lot of different psychoses of young adults, depression, and dyslexia was an issue that was a rare thing 100 years ago. And dyspraxia now is fairly common. That's the uncoordinated movements that people have, and a lot of kids have this problem now. And it's related to some of this problem. The ADD, the ADHD, this is all part of that same picture. And these molecules, what happens is when because of this contributes to a marginalized digestion. You do that over multiple generations, you know, my grandmother to my mother to me, and now on to my kids. You know, I'm not passing on an adequate amount of bacterial diversity. And so actually my number one son has an ADHD problem that we're actually dealing with you know, the proper diet, the Genesis 9 diet now, because we used to be vegetarians, and inducing you know, decent probiotics and all this.
How's that working?
Well, it's a long process. It's actually, for those that might, I'm sure there's people who are listening to this that if they don't have anybody in their immediate family, I'm sure they know some people that have some challenges this way. And I would highly recommend what's called the SCD diet. That's the special carbohydrate diet, where they where you actually refine it at home. And what you're doing is you're taking the child back to a time when you first introduced food. You know, you're actually remember when a child is weaned, you know, let's say he's breastfed for upwards to close to a year. You know, he's had maybe a few teeth come out, and when you start seeing the teeth come out, that's a mark that the body is ready for something other than milk, right? Because what's happening through the course, and I'm actually tell you what, I'm gonna hold off on getting into that, because I go into a little more detail on some other things that are related to that. So let me hold that thought for a minute. But we're getting into a problem because now commercially we have pasteurized milk. You know, it's not raised properly biblically. We've got antibiotic-laden foods, you know, the meat and the milk. You know, and so all this has contributed to a low diversity of our gut microbiome, which is setting us up for leaky gut syndrome. And guess what? When we take in these hybridized grains and they can't digest properly because of these things, guess what? The body actually starts making these what they call pseudomorphines. We wonder why sometimes when we eat bread, and maybe some people can relate to this or know people that have, that when we eat grains, we just feel kind of goofy, almost kind of drunk. Well, it turns out the body with the leaky gut with not enough bacteria, it actually kind of ferments a little bit and makes these pseudomorphines. It's called galactocasiomorphines, gliadin morphines, because gliadin related to the wheat gluten. And so these morphines have a neurological parasitic effect on brain cells that actually disable them, not kill them necessarily, but actually disable brain cells until that product, that gliomorphine is actually metabolized. And when your digestion is marginalized, so is your metabolism. And so sometimes it can take several days for that to pass. But of course, every day, what do? We continue to eat the same kind of grain, the same kind of pasteurized commercial milk. I mean, you know, and so we just get into this vicious cycle and can't get out of it, and we wonder why we have a problem. So, and again, it's the Caucasian group that seems to be most prone to this gut problem, which I find interesting because it's Shem's line through Abraham that, you know, that we have covenants. You know, we call ourselves Christians, and we're part of this Abrahamic covenant. Of course, we repudiated the Old Testament. You know, the Christians have. And so Shem's line is getting in trouble. So now researchers and epidemiologists, they know these conditions that I'm talking about are gaining prominence at a rate consistent with epidemic proportions in several places in this country. In the Detroit and Michigan areas up there, oh man, they have a serious problem with autism and Asperger's problems up there. It's really bad. So these hybridized glutens and these, you know, artificial hormone manipulated caseins, you know, because now the casein, the proteins in the milk are the amino acid sequence, and those are a little messed up, you know, because of what we're feeding the cow. So now we get these proteins that are partially digested as near foreign peptides in a deficient gut line, so that now these are transformed by their own carbohydrate, right? The galactose in the milk and the endosperm in the grain, you know. So now they're starting to ferment in the little lacteals in the small intestine and creating this dysbiotic problem. So anyway, and so now there's a lot of phytic acid that's in this hybridized grain that needs to be taken out, and the best way to do that is to soak it. So for people that want to do, you know, want to be able to have a little more diverse diet by retaining some grain, that's okay, but we need to know how to take care of that gluten, and ideally getting non-hybridized, more heirloom type grains like the kamut, like the spelt. Now kamut is an ancient grain. They haven't messed with that one. If it's labeled as kamut because it's actually copyrighted, that's not hybridized. So many people can actually eat kamut. Some people can't. You know, some of the people that have wheat problems can't do kamut, but most can. What's interesting, the way that they process wheat over in Europe as opposed to here, I've heard so many stories of people that can't do wheat in this country, but when they go over to Europe, they have no problem eating wheat. And it all has to do with the different hybridization, the different way that they process it. So anyway, let's move on a little bit. So this thing about diversity of the bacteria in our gut, this is all contributed by what we feed the gut and also by what we drink. You know, thinking about if we have a habit of drinking municipal water, in other words, water from the tap, we don't have a well, and we're relying on water that has chlorine in it to some degree, and some of it maybe even fluorine, you know, this hampers our gut flora. And even when we shower, now typically, you know, if we don't, you know, we don't spend a lot of time in the shower, taking one shower a day, and if the chlorine, and you can get your water tested and find out what your levels are. You know, some communities have lower levels of chlorine problems than others, but if you can smell the chlorine, or if you, and sometimes we get used to that, but it may not be easy to smell that right off. But you can, but actually getting a shower filter, they're actually not very expensive, and you can actually take your shower head off. You just screw it off, and you can put these little screw-on carbon-based shower filters, and they will actually get a lot of the chlorine out. So consequently, taking a shower, we're not breathing the chlorine, we're not getting it in our open pores with the hot water. And actually, believe it or not, that actually has an impact on our gut flora. Because what happens is when that gets into our body, we breathe in the chlorine, that gets into the blood, and guess what? There's only a 1 cell difference between the little capillaries in this tiny little villi in our small intestine and the gut lumen. 1 cell difference. And if you have a leaky gut problem, guess what? That chlorine's going right through that, man. And it's going to get right into your flora, what you have left of flora. So people that have a leaky gut problem are going to be more prone to the shower problem. So you definitely, if your municipal water issues, you've got a leaky gut problem, you got any family members that have any of those conditions that I mentioned, I'd highly recommend getting a shower filter, getting a you know, an under the sink filter for, you know, if you're drinking water from the tap. Definitely need to do that. So, and the other thing is, of course, you know, is intentional and covert use of antibiotics. Now, the intentional use being prescriptions, and the covert being those trace amounts that we get, right? Conventionally raised eggs and meats and butters and milk and all that kind of stuff. So you know, it's worth the investment in your health to pay that little bit more for organic food as opposed to the commercial stuff. Consider it health insurance. And let's see. So the Hebrews, even with an untainted, lower gluten grain, you know, they would sprout a lot of their wheat berries. This is where this all came from. They would occasionally mash and sun dry those sprouts, and then stone ground those, and, you know, make their own special kind of leavened bread many times, because there's no gluten left in it. So they would make a special kind of leavened bread that way. Some Hebrews would take these mashed sprouts, put them in clay jars to culture for 2 or 3 days, and of course, if you do that without sugar, it's not gonna create an alcohol, right? But it's gonna do a natural sour and create a special kind of sourdough, which some people, you know, if you did that without yeast, you know, some people might call that manna bread today. Of course, we know manna, you know, the word manna in Hebrew, that means what is it? They you know, the children of Israel out in the wilderness, they had no clue what that stuff was that was coming out of the sky. But there's a lot of people that have theorized that maybe this could have been some kind of kefir-like probiotic food, because it was described as being like a hoary frost that would melt in the noonday sun, and it would stink if it was kept more than a day, and it would breed worms. So it kind of sounds like it could be a naturally cultured food. Just kind of an interesting thought, but even after when the manna stopped, the Hebrews were raising crops, and they'd ask Yahweh, you know, hey, Father, we ask that you give us our daily bread. Because what they would do is they would take their grain, and daily they would grind it, and they would make that bread that day, or maybe even the next day, because they come to understand that once you make flour, it actually loses its nutrient value and begins to rancidize within 3 days, or about 72 hours. Even if you refrigerated flour, which all of us do, right? Some of us don't even refrigerate it. What happens is, you know, the germs have been exposed to the oxygen and to the light. and within 72 hours, boom, the nutrient content, you're better off putting it on your compost pile at that point. So we're better off is making our own bread, is to be able to do that, using organic heirloom varieties and get a grain mill. So anyhow, now I wanted to get to, let's see here. Oh yeah, I wanted to bring out this one principle, and see, this is exactly what the Hebrews understood. You know, when our Savior, now he was talking about the principle of marriage when he said this, but this applies with food as well. He says, whatsoever God has brought together, let no man put asunder. And it says, whatsoever God has brought together, right? So whatever he's caused to grow, the way that he intended the plant bringing forth seed of itself, as opposed to hybridized and GMO stuff that can't do that, right? We're not to take all that stuff apart. We're supposed to keep it all together. He purposely designed it in a particular ratio for our benefit when we consume it. And when we start taking it apart and taking this out and taking that out, maybe adding this to that, you know, we're just asking for more problems. Yahweh can't really bless that. So after so many generations of consuming refined, somewhat rancidized flour, because a lot of times the commercial flours, they will add chemical stabilizers to it and deodorizers, so you can't really smell it. And that's why, you know, back then they could smell that, they could see it. I mean, you know, we can't tell that today. So, you know, these are just some things to think about when we're getting commercial bread. We want organic sprouted bread if we're going to do whole grain breads. So now we are presently in the third and fourth generation of these super hybrids and sterile cyborg seeds, if you will, right? The GMO stuff. And we, as a human race, can only continue to be fruitful and multiply by his directives. So he wants us to partake of clean, unadulterated food for both man and our animals, all of which are a type of fruit of the ground, each to grow and propagate by his design. And so the closer we eat to his ordained food by his means, the more nutrients are going to be retained for the proper ratio, for the optimum health of all of its creatures, really. So now I wanted to get to a certain point here. Yeah, here's an interesting thing to consider. This is another Hebrew practice of tending their garden. What they used to do, they would take their pre-soaked grains many times, and they would place a certain amount of those pre-soaked grains into their mouth while they tilled the soil, so that their mouth, while those pre-soaked seeds in their mouth, mixing them well with their own saliva held between their cheek and gum, just long enough to hoe a row or to plow the length of a field. And this gave enough time for the pre-soaked seeds to absorb the saliva of the farmer, and that saliva would then transpose a unique, you know, hit that farmer's unique physiological template into the seed coat to convey the molecular message of the biological needs of the farmer to the seed. Wow. Now, you can't do that with hybridized stuff. You can't do that with GMO stuff. And so now this is what they would do. They would take that then, this now communicated seed, and then on the next pass of the row, they would plant that. And while the farmer's doing this, he's tilling the ground, the loose soil, and he would do it in his bare feet, while his feet retained the connection with the soil. The bottom of the soles of his feet actually conveyed his biological condition to the soil. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have had a chance or have heard about foot bath ionization for getting rid of toxins out of the body. I remember years ago when I first heard about it, I thought, yeah, right. I actually read a few studies on it. We did some experiments, and we actually decided to do some ionizing foot baths at our clinic, and there's really something to it. And so we know that the soles of the feet, there's chemicals that, you know, chemicals inherent in the body. You know, everybody's, you know, heard of people with smelly feet, right? Well, they got certain needs in their body, let me tell you. Well, the soles of the feet can communicate, just like the saliva can to the seed. The soles of our feet communicating to the soft, moist ground, to the living soil. Has to be living soil. In other words, it's got to have the saprophytes and the balance of microorganisms in there. And we actually communicate with them with the soles of our feet. And so now, consequently, when you plant that seed with the saliva template of that farmer, and now the farmer's own, the same message he's communicating via the soles of his feet into the soil, now the seed and saprophyte can work together to grow and pull from the soil the nutrients necessary for the benefit of the farmer. Isn't that incredible? And then they would do this, they would plant and harvest according to the phase of the moon, and do this at the right time of the day or night sometimes, depending on what that plant is. And then after years of tilling the soil, we know every 7 years they would rest the soil. One means of soil replenishment, besides the customary composting of the discards from the plants and the animals, was to take various kinds of rocks, certain rocks known to have the right balance of minerals to enhance certain kinds of crops, and they would collect these different kinds of rocks for the 7th year. And in that year of the rest for the land, that they would take these rocks and put it in their fire pit, and sometimes with the right kind of wood, different kinds of plant, or maybe even dung, they would cook their meals, and afterwards they would pour cold water on that. And of course, if they did this in the winter, they'd have cold water, right? So they'd pour cold water on that, and so the hot rocks with the cold water, they would actually fractionate. And depending on the density and the type of rock determines how many times you might have to fire the rocks, use them in your pit to cook with, before they actually would be poundable. You could actually crush the rock with a hammer, and some of them you can crush easily to dust, and some to smaller pebbles type sizes. And they would do this, and they would add this to their ash and their compost, and spread this, broadcast it out into their field in that 7th year, to just kind of add more diversity to the ground, so that in some respects they're adding every 7th year they're adding a little bit more, right? So
sounds like fertilizing.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat process.
Well, it's a very complicated scientific process.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, and I'm sure they had experts back then. As to that, people were mentored. They probably, they had apprentices probably in those concepts. Different kinds of rocks for different kinds of plants and all that. But and so today, see, we haven't heard about these processes. We've lost these methods of farming because man's resorted to hybridization, now for the sake of control. Man's now going to GMOs, completely adulterating, the antediluvian heritage of seed that we had. And this is all in man's attempt to improve crop yields, control propagation, and who gets the money, who gets to eat, and who doesn't, with no consideration of nutrition and the drawback that that's going to have on the human body and the toxic load and all this. Completely devoid of Yahweh's directives on how to take care of the land and all this. So now here we are now reaping the negative benefits of our own devising that is affecting our own soil and our own gut. And so now medicine in its finite wisdom, they devise drugs to manage the diseases now that come about with all this multiple generations of this kind of growing and kind of food that we're planting and all this, to the extent that now, here we have baby boomers who are actually 3rd generation of some of this practice. We're looking at our kids and our grandkids as the 4th generation, but we're baby boomers. We're really a 3rd generation of this stuff. And consider this idea. I remember coming across some of these statistics and put them together, and it just kind of shocked me. Consider now Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. Now, both of those diseases, they're actually more common now. They're more prominent amongst chronic diseases in our society, 3 times faster than heart disease since 1990, 25 years ago. That's a 30% increase. Now consider the idea, with that in mind, the first statin drugs were approved just before that. In 1987, September of 1987, were the first statin drugs approved. Then you had the first SSRI drugs like Prozac. That's your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors for depression and things. And Prozac was one of the big ones that came out in December of 1987. And the first generation of second generation fluoroquinones of antibiotics. We have all sorts of families of antibiotics, all right? But the second generation of what they call fluoroquinolones antibiotic, which was called ciprofloxacin. Floxacin. Yeah, that's right.
Cipro.
Cipro, right, exactly. Known it as Cipro. It's the most inexpensive antibiotic. That also came out in 1987. Now this is all the same year. That's just 3 years before 1990, right? Now you couple that with vaccines. Now also in the early 1990s, guess what they started doing with the vaccines? They started adding peanut oil into the vaccine. Do we wonder why that a lot of kids now have peanut allergies? That's where it all came from. But now if you add all the vaccines with these new antibiotics, and we had the rise of what? In the late 1980s, we had the rise of HIV. Hepatitis C started making itself known in the 1990s also. And the use of the most prescribed antibiotic of all time, actually, is azithromycin. It's known as Zithromax. And it was called Z-Pak in the hospitals when they used it for IVs. And that one has a pretty profound microlide. It's a breakdown of that product that's pretty toxic to the liver. And they weren't aware of that at the time. And so you don't see Zithromax being used anymore. But there was a whole generation of people that had been subject to that stuff. And so we wonder why. So all this stuff is contributing to Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, because the basis and the problem of Parkinson's disease is actually the gut. More serotonin is made in the gut than only 5% of the serotonin is made in your brain. Now we know it's dopamine that is the issue with Parkinson's disease, but the controlling factor of dopamine is serotonin. And if you don't have the right diversity of bacteria in your gut, man, you're going to set yourself up for that problem. And so all the chronic diseases that we're succumbing to in our later generations, Yahweh didn't want, he wanted us to die a natural age. Granted, he gave us 70, right? But he wanted to live a full, vibrant life during that time. And he says, and if you have strength, another 10 years, right? So we should be able to live to our 80s without a problem. But we're having people in their 40s having chronic disease problems. And it's because of a lot of this kind of stuff. Now, if you consider the early onset of Parkinson's disease, now I'm just using this one as an example, right? The early onset of Parkinson's disease is constipation, depression, anxiety, anosmia, which is not being able to smell very well, and a deficiency in the 4th stage of sleep. Now consider the side effects of all those drugs that I just mentioned to you. The side effects of statins are depression and the reduction of the 4th stage of sleep. The side effects of Cipro is anosmia, not being able to smell. And from Zithromax, anxiety and constipation. Those are all the precursors of the beginnings of Parkinson's disease. This is all from our diets, everybody. And because of what the medicine's been doing with this. So we have a diet problem and a medicine problem for a double whammy. And so, this antibiotic use was just, the technology just started taking off in the 1960s. And now that's when I was growing up, and many of you probably, and predisposing this new baby boomer, generation, all of us here, to a greatly reduced microbiota. Now, and then, we get hit with all these drugs and all this. And many of us, like myself, we were bottle fed too. We weren't breastfed. And so we're missing out on a lot of bacteria there too. And all this, and you hybridize food and this crossbreeding of the seeds, And so we wonder why we're not taking up enough zinc and copper and iron and magnesium and all this. And because of our lack of diversity, our body can't absorb some of these minerals. You can, in fact, they say that they actually have found, because of this microbiome reduction in our gut, that those minerals that I just mentioned, including selenium here, so it's zinc, copper, iron, magnesium, and selenium, that without a reduction in the soil, because of the lack of diversity in our gut, we have a reduction in our own gut soil by 19, or in terms of our ability to absorb that, in a reduction 19 to 28% they found. So anyway.
Amazing.
So I'm basically making a pitch here for probiotics and cultured and properly fermented vegetable type foods. Anyway, you had a question, Jackson, or anybody?
No, I just say our time's about finished now.
Okay.
We can come back to this if you've got more remedies later on.
Yeah, I hadn't gotten into the fat part.
Well, let's revisit this.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we can pick it up from here.
Excellent. You got nice views on YouTube of this, and it's also going on Hebrew Nation Radio. It'll be up on YouTube, well, within an hour after we finish here.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool.
But I want to thank you so much again for your time in explaining. That was probably the best explanation I've ever heard of the origins of some of these things. And Tony Bank, he agrees with me. Amen. Thank you, Brother Mark.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being there.